Hello everyone, I'm bringing you a video today which steers the channel away from East German kit for a change. There's been a lot of East German kit on the channel recently. We're going back to American, US Vietnam War era kit. And what we're looking at here is a collection of 3 pairs of jungle boots from the 2nd issue through the 4th issue. And I don't have a pair of 1st issue, unfortunately, repro or original. I may pick up a pair of repros at some point in the future. Very happy to have a pair of 2nd pattern, 2nd issue boots. And that's what we're going to have a look at here, is the development from the 2nd issue onwards. We'll talk a little bit about the 1st pattern as well, but that's what we're going to have a look at in the video now. So what I've done here is taken 1 boot from each of the 3 pairs of boots we're going to look at, just to do a quick side-by-side comparison at the start here. And another thing I'll mention is the reason I wanted to get these 3 patterns of boot in the collection and originals of them is because these are the 3 patterns of this boot which were made in larger numbers and issued extensively in Vietnam. The 3rd pattern in the middle here is by far the most common, and we'll get on to talking a bit more about that in a minute. But the first of these to be manufactured in any great numbers was the 2nd pattern, which we have here. And then the final design is the 3rd pattern, which basically took over production. Production of this became standardized in 1968, 1969, somewhere around there. Certainly you do see the 3rd pattern manufactured in 1968 to some degree. By 1969, production had definitely switched over. So we'll talk a little bit more about the issue of these, the dates and so forth, as we run through and look at each pair individually. But the biggest visual difference that you'll see between the 2nd pattern and the 3rd pattern is the addition of the ankle reinforcement, which you can see on the 3rd pattern here. And then the biggest visual difference between the 3rd pattern and what I refer to as the 4th pattern, some people just refer to this as the 3rd pattern with Panama sole, is the change in sole design. So you have the Panama sole here as opposed to the Vibram, which had gone before. And again, that's something we'll have a look at in detail in just a moment when we look at all of these boots as pairs. So as I say, the reason I wanted these 3 is these are the boots which were produced in larger numbers and issued in larger numbers in Vietnam. I may well pick up reproduction examples of the 1st pattern, and when I'm talking about the 2nd pattern here, I will refer to the details which differentiate this from the 1st pattern, much as I don't have a pair of 1st pattern boots to talk about. So that's what we're going to get into now. We'll have a look at each of these pairs of boots in a bit more detail. So these are the 2nd pattern boots we're going to talk about. Before we get into these in any detail, I'll just quickly mention the 1st pattern here. As I say, I don't have examples of those. May pick up reproductions at some point in the future. If I saw a pair of 1st patterns at a really good price, I might pick them up, but they're very much more associated with the advisory period of the Vietnam War, which I'm not as interested in. So they're not really a focus of mine, and certainly something I would not go out of my way to try and pick up for the collection. They were introduced in 1962, and they differed from these primarily in having a black leather section around the cuff of the boot here in place of this nylon, and a black leather backstay coming up the back as well. Other than that, they are very visually similar to these. They lack the ankle reinforcement, which we'll see in the 3rd pattern and so forth. So what we're seeing here is a change by increment, and so we've got less leather on these. The 1st pattern had leather up here and down the back. That here has been replaced with webbing with the backstay and the edging around the cuff. Both of those have been replaced with this webbing, as you can see. So the 1st pattern appears in 1962. The 2nd pattern, which we're looking at here, then appears midway through 1964, middle of 1964. Some of the earliest examples of boots surviving of this pattern date from mid-1964, and they were produced through until around mid-1966, and there's some overlap there with the 3rd pattern, which we're going to look at next. So that's something to note here, is for each change there is an overlap of production of the earlier type with the newer version as contracts work through and so forth. So again, you've got to think of that sort of in the stock system, as we'll talk about in a minute. The 3rd pattern, even though it was replaced in production with the 4th pattern with the Panama sole, the 3rd pattern with the Vibram sole is still the most common boot to be seen right the way through to the end of the Vietnam War, or certainly the end of American involvement in the Vietnam War, American combat troops, that is. So that's just something to note here at the beginning as well. The 2nd pattern exhibit all the features of the tropical combat boot which were present in the 1st pattern, other than the leather backstay and leather around here. So not a bad starting point from that point of view. As you can see, the part of the uppers here are made of a nylon duck, a green nylon duck, and then you have the nylon backstay and the nylon edging around the cuff here. And then the heel and the toe box are both made of black leather, and you have black leather reinforcement up round here for the lacing eyelets, which, as you can see, are made of aluminium and painted black on the outside there. This came to me with this pair of boots came to me with flat cotton laces. I don't know if they're original. We have different laces in all of these, slightly different laces in all of these. So this is just how they came to me, and I've left them laced as they were when they came to me. We turn this around here. We can see first of all, the marking upon the nylon webbing here. 12 extra narrow is the size, and then we can just make out here 65 and then 11 before that. So these would be November 1965 production. So midway through production of these, basically, or getting into the later part of production of these. They seem to disappear from production in mid-1966, as I say. US sizing is obviously one smaller, than in the UK. So if you need a 10 in the UK, you need an 11 in the US, for example. I'm somewhere between a UK 10 or 11, and it depends on the manufacturer to a large degree, probably a 10.5, but it depends on the manufacturer. So I need a US 11 or 12, and although these are extra narrow, I can get into them. So these boots were made in both a sizing for the length of foot, 12, and then they were made in various width fittings, and extra narrow is one example of that sort of size fitting, that width size fitting. Another interesting feature of these, you can see in the lower part of the uppers here, we have these mesh eyelets, and they are of course to allow water to drain out of these, an important part of the design. Something I can't show you with these, which would have been included in these originally, is a set of mesh insoles. These came without them, and I've not replaced them with sort of modern examples, which you can still get. They're still around, they're still manufactured. So I will probably put a pair of mesh insoles in these at some point. I have the originals in it in the third pattern, which we'll look at in just a moment, but just to note, they would have been included in these as well. I'll talk about the reason for those in just a minute. And then underneath you can see the Vibram sole pattern, which carried through from the first pattern of these boots. So this hadn't changed at this point. And you can see there we again have the sizing on the sole there, 12 extra narrow. So very little wear on these, if any. I think the sort of wear to the leather and so forth is primarily stores wear from storage, and just the leather being a bit dry and so forth. I have treated it since, but they're in very nice condition. I was very happy to pick these up for a pretty good price, really. They are an odd sizing in being extra narrow, but as I say, good enough for my purposes. I don't plan to wear them very often, and I can squeeze into them for photographs and so forth if I wanted to recreate kit. That's the second pattern. We'll move on now to have a look at the third pattern. So here we have the third pattern boots, and these were first introduced in very late 1965, or at least the first version of these were introduced then. There's an argument that you could actually potentially split this into two different patterns, and you'd end up with a fourth pattern and then a fifth pattern. Obviously what we're going to look at as the fourth pattern would end up being the fifth pattern. But there's no visual difference between the two versions of these. What was introduced was a spike protective sole, and that appears in 1966, so some time after the initial production of these, but they are visually indistinguishable from the outside externally, but you do have that introduction of the spike protective sole, which is just something that's obviously needs to be mentioned here. These have that, so they're slightly later production, and we'll see that when we look at these, when we look at the date and so forth stamped on these. The major visual difference between these and the second pattern, which we've just looked at, is the ankle reinforcement here, which is another piece of nylon webbing added onto the nylon duck, and it just strengthens the uppers somewhat there and gives better ankle support and protection. Otherwise, the uppers and so forth, the design is exactly the same leather reinforcing for the eyelets there, and that's basically unchanged in that regard. As I mentioned, the laces are different for these. These have round nylon laces, which again could well be original to these, but I don't know for sure. These have a feature which is often sort of noted in Vietnam jungle boots, which is a stitch, a row of stitches in the heel here, as you can see. And we again have the nylon backstay and the nylon edging around the cuff of the boot there. We also have the eyelets, the drainage eyelets, a slightly different design, but that does vary from manufacturer to manufacturer. We have the two drainage eyelets there on the side, and the Vibram sole, and you have the manufacturer stamped on this one as well, which is Genesco, as you can see there. These are 11R, which is perfect for me, so 11 regular. These fit really well, and you can see here the CIC mark there as well. And these have seen quite a bit more use, and actually there's been some melting of these somehow at some point in the past. But these are boots I'd be happy to wear. I'd quite like to pick up a pair of these with some heavy wear to them. You do see in the field these with, well, various patterns worn in Vietnam with heavy wear to the leather. And I do keep an eye out periodically for a pair that have seen some heavy use, be it in reenacting or whatever, but it would be quite nice to have a pair that are heavily weathered. I certainly don't want to do that myself to a pair of boots, but if I could find a pair of these with that sort of weathering, I'd be interested to find them and pick them up and add them to the collection for wearing occasionally. And not that I do a lot of US Vietnam reenacting, but if and when, it would be nice to have them. Look at the marking on the tongue here now. You can see we have the size again, 11R, and then we have the date here of 6/67, so June 1967 is the manufacturing date for these. And we have spike protective. Of course, these are manufactured after that change, after the introduction of the spike protective sole. So these are spike protective version of the third pattern. As I say, the earliest examples weren't, but that's an important change to the design to give protection against punji traps, of course. And these actually have the details of the chap they're issued to written into the, you can see obviously details written in there on a section that's been painted white and then marked up with a Sharpie or another kind of marker there, as you can see. And these include the mesh insole, which I mentioned previously, which we can see here. Do not boil, which is of course an important instruction there. And then we have 11R, the sizing, so they're the correct size of insole for these boots. And the idea of this is it lifts the foot off the sole of the boot and gives a little bit of area for air to circulate. And these were used not only in these, but in various cold weather boots as well. The British Army used this type of insole too. And obviously in a cold weather environment, it gives you a layer of insulation. It allows an air cushion under the foot, so there's not as much heat being conducted through the sole as there would be otherwise. In this instance, it's to sort of allow the foot to breathe to some degree, although again, limited utility in that regard, but better than nothing, I suppose. That's the logic behind having the insoles in anyway. I'll put that back in there if I can, sort of feed it down inside. There we go. And that's basically it for the third pattern. As I say, produced from very late 1965, right the way through 1968, and certainly in production in 1968 still, although the fourth pattern, was in production by that point, and these would remain the most common boot right the way through the end of the Vietnam War, as I say, because the stocks of these have been built up in Vietnam, and although the Panama sole version, which we're going to look at, does start turning up in photos later on, these are still the most common boot right the way through the end of the involvement of US combat troops. So we'll move on now to have a look at the fourth pattern. So these fourth pattern boots really are in lovely condition, and the main difference with these is of course the sole. The uppers, there's not much to speak of here really, because there isn't any great change from the third pattern. You still have the reinforcement for the ankle. The uppers haven't changed in terms of overall design, but you have the very distinctive Panama sole, and you can see that there. These are Row Search boots, and these are actually a size up 12 regular, 12R, and they do fit fine. I tend to wear them with a thicker pair of socks, but that's absolutely fine. They fit very well, and these were a gift from my friend Ian Parker in the US. Sent me these as a package, as part of a package quite a while ago, and they really are a lovely pair of boots. You can see here we don't have the stitching on the back of the heel in this instance. Just something to note, you do find this present and lacking on Vietnam War era boots, so just something to note here, it's not always there. And again, we actually have the marking on the tongue here, and these are again 12R, the size is marked there again, spike protective of course, and the date here is May of 1968, so fairly early in production in 1968. The design of the sole, the Panama sole, was approved in 1967, but it seems that there was a bit of a delay in production, possibly because there were so many contracts running for the Vibram sole boots that they don't really show up in production until 1968. So a lovely pair from that point of view, having that early 1968 or relatively early 1968 date, as I say. And they were produced right the way through, and then they were produced post-war as well, of course. They seem to be the definite standard in 1969. As noted in 68, you still see some of the third pattern being produced with the Vibram sole, Exactly when in 1968 that stopped is not clear, but certainly by 1969 the Panama sole boot was the standard boot in production. But as mentioned, there were so many Vibram sole boots, so many third pattern boots in stock that even troops going out and being issued boots long after these had become standard in production were still being issued Vibram sole boots because they'd been sat in stores for a couple of years, and there were still plenty of them about. So definitely these do turn up late on in the Vietnam War. There's no doubt of that at all. They were used in country. Obviously they were produced from 68 onwards. So certainly in 69 you begin to see a smattering of these, late 68. But as I say, the Vibram sole remain, the third pattern with the Vibram sole remain the most common through the end of the war. Final thing to mention here, again, these have round nylon laces with sort of bound tips on them. Again, they're just what came with the boots. And a fine little detail to mention, which doesn't really relate to the boot, but how these came, as I say, is the fact there's an ID tag, a dog tag attached to the laces here, which is something I understand was done to some degree. One dog tag worn around the neck and the other one on the boot, because the feet and the boots often survived when the rest of the body didn't necessarily, which is a gruesome and detail, but something to mention here. It was occasionally done that a dog tag would be attached onto the boot, though I believe it's entirely non-regulation. It was done to some degree, and as I say, that's how the boots came, so I've just left that on there on the lace. So that's a quick run through these different patterns of boots and a sort of run through the dates to a degree, although it's difficult to put exact dates on this because, as I say, there's the overlap in production, and then obviously so many Vibram sole boots in the system that these don't show up in huge numbers before the end. But as I say, hopefully this has been useful as a bit of a guide, and I thought it would be interesting looking at these various boots in a bit of detail. So I hope you found that interesting. As I say, a deviation from sort of East German kit, which has been dominating on the channel recently, and I will try and mix things up a little bit more. We may have some Dutch kit in the next video possibly, or more US Vietnam kit, we'll see. I haven't decided yet what the next video is going to cover, but it will be something different, and then we potentially get back to some more East German bits and pieces after that. But that's it for this video. As I say, I do hope you found it interesting. If you have and you'd like to see more of this sort of thing, please do consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. And whether you're newly subscribing or you've previously subscribed, please do make sure you hit the little bell, the notification button down below. That will of course alert you when I upload future videos. That's everything for this video, so until next time, bye for now.